Welcome to UNU Online. My name is David Malone, and I have the privilege of working at the UN University. It's headquartered in Tokyo, although we're present in 16 locations throughout the world. And this evening in Tokyo, we'll be having with us for a public conversation the great Asian thinker, and more incidentally, diplomat, Kishore Mahbubani, who in his day job is dean of the tremendously successful Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore, which focuses on public policy and international relations. But he does much more than that. He's been a fabulous dean, but he also engages the rest of the world in thinking about Asia, and he provokes the rest of the world to think about Asia, just as he thinks about the rest of the world routinely and always has. He was Secretary General or Permanent Secretary of the Foreign Ministry in Singapore in the 90s, twice ambassador to the UN, with a small but very potent delegation. He was Singapore's first ambassador on the Security Council, and he presided over the Security Council during his term for part of it. Very forceful figure at the UN, very highly regarded. And tonight we're going to talk about an article that he has just perpetrated in the prestigious Foreign Affairs magazine with Larry Summers, the former US Treasury Secretary, former Harvard president also. And it argues that far from the West being unhappy with the state of the world, in many ways the state of the world is evidence of a growing fusion of civilizations. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you, Kishore, about your line of thinking perhaps 15 years ago when you wrote a book called Can Asians Think? And its thesis was, of course, that Asians do think, but they think differently, in fact, and that the rest of the world should be paying more attention to Asian thought. And I actually agreed at the time. But could you tell us a bit about that and about how that set of ideas relates to the new set of ideas that Secretary Summers and you lay out in this fascinating article?
Well, let me begin, David, by thanking you for that very generous introduction. You're much too kind, and it's also very kind of you to remember what I wrote in Can Asians Think in 1998. It was published, actually. The big difference between the 1990s, when I wrote my essays about Asia, and in a sense 20 years later in what you call the 2010s, the big difference is that in the early 1990s you had experienced the end of the Cold War, where the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Berlin Wall had come down, and the West was triumphant. So there was an amazing triumphal mood in the West, captured in that very famous essay by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History.
Absolutely.
Where he said, we have reached the end of history, and all of us are going to converge and become, in a sense, clones of liberal democratic societies of the West. So essentially he said that the rest of the world, catch up, you're going to become like the West. What's amazing, you fast forward 20 years later, and amazingly, instead of a triumphant mood in the West, if you go to Western capitals today, to even Paris or London, you get a sense of pessimism about the future, a sense of foreboding about the future. So instead, now I find that as an Asian, one of my responsibilities is to tell the West, don't give up on the world. Actually, the world is going to be a better and better place. So the biggest message that Larry Summers and I try to convey in the fusion of civilizations is that if you study the world objectively, from the point of view of the 7 billion people who live on planet Earth, for the vast majority of them, the past 30 years have been the best 30 years they've enjoyed in the past 300 years. So, you know, for them, they can see the world is going to be better and better. There's less and less conflicts. Less and less people in the rest of the world are dying from wars. And at the same time, our goal to reduce poverty and the Millennium Development Goal of halving global poverty by 2015, we are exceeding. The global middle classes are exploding. So in a sense, if you compare the 1990s with the world today, at that time it seemed as though the West was triumphant, everybody's going to be like them. Now you have an opposite situation where the West is pessimistic and the rest of the world is saying, cheer up, it's not that bad.
Well, in a way it's understandable, of course, because as you point out, things are so much better for much of the developing world, notably. The 15 years from about 2000 to currently have been great years for Asia overall, very good years for Africa, the first good years they've had since decolonization probably. And in Latin America, we've had a lot of social development, even if there hasn't been much growth. But no wonder the West is depressed. Europe has been stagnating one way or the other since the 2008 financial crisis. And North America is pulling out of it, it seems, but not with the dynamism that characterized American economic recoveries in the past. So there is a loss of self-confidence, I think.
Well, I would say I would make a distinction between Europe and America. Because I would say certainly, and even in America, I'd make a distinction between the East Coast and the West Coast. Because today, even if you go, I was in California several months ago, 6 to 8 months ago, and California is bubbling with optimism. And you know, the way the new enterprises come up, and you know, certainly when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, there was no Google, no Facebook. You know, no Amazon, no Twitter, and so on and so forth. See how much the world has changed in the last 20 years. So in many ways, some of the American optimism still remains. Of course, there are parts of America that are depressed, and that explains why Donald Trump is doing so well. But Europe is a different story. And again, in Europe, I would again distinguish between Germany, which still, overall, the German economy is doing well. The German export machine is still amazing. And I would contrast it with states like France and Italy, which are still reluctant to make the structural changes that they have to make to adapt. I mean, if you in today's competitive world, you cannot have a 35-hour week in France. I mean, I'm glad that President Francois Hollande is finally trying to do something about it, but it's too little and too late. But what you need in Europe today actually are leaders who say that the world is changing and we have to adapt and change.
Absolutely. Now, all of this happens at a time when great power rivalry has reemerged after an immediate post-Cold War era when the rivalry, at least between the United States and the Soviet Union, then the Russian Federation, seemed to have subsided. We have a triangular great military power relationship involving the US, Russian Federation, China, that is quite a lot more tense, with none of them having ideal relations with the other, and knock-on effects as well for other groups of states. So in that sense also the article that you both wrote is a bit counterintuitive relative to what most of us perceive as a negative development in the last, say, 10 years.
Yes, I think, you know, we certainly don't claim that all problems have disappeared from planet Earth. And especially at a time like this, when you're seeing the greatest shift of geopolitical power we've ever seen in human history, you know, where the world's number one, United States, is about to become number two to a new number one, which is China, that will emerge with the world's largest economy sometime in the next decade or two. And that's quite remarkable because it'll be the first time in, I think, over 200 years that a non-Western power will have the world's largest economy. And so a lot of adjustments have to be made. The question is, will these adjustments happen peacefully or will there be war? Now, if this was 1916 instead of 2016, I would say in 1916 there would be wars, and indeed there were major wars. World War I was happening exactly 100 years ago. But the dynamic of the world has changed. And the impulse to go to war, which existed 100 years ago, no longer exists. And remember, 100 years ago, it was very fashionable for young students from Oxford and Cambridge to pick up a rifle and say, let's go fight a war for merry England, you know? Now, today, you go to Oxford and Cambridge, you think you're mad to go to war? So there's something has changed fundamentally in the world. And by the way, this is confirmed by data by a Harvard professor, Steven Pinker.
Yes, yeah.
And he actually has pointed out that there's a long-term trend where wars and violence in general are diminishing in human affairs. So I'm confident that geopolitical rivalries will continue between United States and China, United States and Russia, and also between Russia and China, but there'll be no wars between the three of them.
Well, I agree with you. I think Pinker's data is actually a bit out of date because in the last 5 years, wars have been ticking up again. But where he's right is none of them are wars that threaten global peace. They're usually localized wars, horrible for the people involved, much worse than some wars used to be. But none of them threaten the global peace, whereas 100 years ago, as you point out, in full-blown World War I, so many countries were affected. For those of you watching us online, we're going to bring it to a halt here. If you come to Tokyo, please come and visit us. We have public conversations about once every 2 weeks during classic term time, say September to June. We're very honored to have Kishore with us this evening, and we look forward to hearing from him more this evening. Thank you very much.